and welcome to Restoring the Future, Helping Nature Adapt to Climate Change. My name is Elisa Rawlings and I'm a Science and Planning Manager at Greening Australia.
And I'm Christopher Ewing, a Program Manager in the Landscape Restoration and Protection team at WWF-Australia. We'll be your co-hosts for today's webinar.
Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and pay our respect to their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and any other Indigenous people who are joining the conversation today. I know we have guests dialing in from across Australia and around the world, so please join in the chat and tell us where you're from by using the chat with all panelists and attendees option in the chat box to say hello. We invite all of you to introduce yourselves in the chat and acknowledge the country from where you're joining the conversation today. In this webinar, we will discuss how practical action can help nature adapt to a changing climate. To discuss the topic, we're very privileged to have three very special guests with us today. Our panellists are Professor Lesley Hughes, Founding Councillor with the Climate Council of Australia, Director for WWF-Australia, and Distinguished Professor of Biology. Our second panellist is Dr. Madelon Willemsen, Healthy Landscapes Mission Lead in the Fire and Flood Resilience Initiative of the Minderoo Foundation, and Dr. Veronica Doerr, a Research Program Manager for Climate Change in the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. Thank you to all the panellists for joining us today. We'll be running a Q&A event with our panellists towards the end of this session today, so I invite you all to use the chat function to post your questions throughout the discussion, and we'll get to as many of these questions as we can in the last 15 minutes of our event.
Before we introduce our panellists, we'd like to set the context for today's discussion. In the bushfires of 2019-2020, 24 million hectares of land was burnt, 3,000 homes were destroyed, lives were lost, and 3 billion animals were killed or displaced. The disaster made headlines around the world. And since then, we've seen more climate-induced disasters occurring. We've even seen trees quietly dying en masse across our suburbs and in regional areas too. Now, we all know that reducing global carbon emissions is paramount to averting catastrophe for people and nature. Given all the recent media coverage in the lead up to November's COP26, it is certainly clear that Australia will make some kind of commitment to reduce emissions. However, climate change is already impacting communities and nature, and we need to adapt because historic emissions are already baked into the system and the climate will continue to change. And as conservationists, we have to prepare for that. So Greening Australia and WWF Australia have recently launched what we're calling our Climate Ready Restoration Partnership. Our organisations do not have all the answers, but we know that many of you share our vision for a brighter future for people and nature. That's why we're pursuing a community of practice in the form of the Climate Ready Restoration Knowledge Hub. The fundamental purpose of this hub is to rapidly share insights and lessons. We're not talking about reinventing the wheel here. Instead, the hub will rely on existing communication tools and channels such as social media, webinars just like this one, professional collectives and working groups to get the word out. We'll also be looking at things for sharing action and what people are doing on the ground, such as the Crowther Labs Restore platform, which is an open data platform to support and connect the global restoration movement. We need to act fast. This decade is going to be decisive for the world. So let's get started with the discussion. Thanks so much for joining us, Lesley, Madelon, Veronica. We only have you for an hour, so let's dive into it. First off, Lesley, in a paper in The Conversation recently, you described Australia as being seriously ugly as a consequence of climate change. Australians are already beginning to witness these ugly impacts. Can you set the scene for us and describe what seriously ugly looks like for Australia?
Well, the article, thanks Chris, and thanks Elisa for asking me along today. The article in The Conversation was really highlighting the fact that Australia could be heading for a warming of 3 degrees because at the current rate of emissions and the current gap between what we're emitting and what countries have promised to try to stop emitting, emissions are still rising quite sharply, and that it'll take us to 3 degrees without really significant action in the next decade. So 3 degrees of warming, and if we consider that the world has already warmed on average 1.2 degrees, and Australia has already warmed, as at the end of last year, 1.44 degrees. And if we think of what we've seen with 1.2 degrees of global warming, we've seen the Black Summer bushfires, for example, that you mentioned earlier, which of course started in winter, not summer, burnt millions of hectares. We're seeing sea levels rise very rapidly and intruding into freshwater ecosystems. We're seeing a sharp increase in heat waves and extreme hot days. We're seeing the water cycle intensify with dry areas getting drier and wet areas getting wetter. And all of those things are pushing ecosystems really to the limit. So a recent paper that I published with a number of colleagues identified 19 separate Australian ecosystems that were collapsing at some part of their range. And that was everything from coral reefs to inland savanna areas to the subantarctic and Macquarie Island. So if we think about that all happening with 1.2 degrees, you know, what could happen with 3 degrees of warming is almost unimaginable. You know, it really is. And we absolutely have to act really, really strongly this decade, which is why the upcoming COP in Glasgow is so important. But as you said, a lot of change is already baked into the system. Things are going to get worse before they get better, even if the Glasgow meeting is a big success. So we have to plan in terms of adaptation for considerably more warming and disruption, at least over the next 2 to 3 decades. And that's going to require not a business as usual approach to conservation, but I know we'll be unpacking that more as we go through this webinar. So I'll stop there for the moment.
Thanks, Lesley. That's great. Veronica, you originally worked in landscape conservation in Australia, but you've now shifted to sustainable agriculture in international development. What are the broader lessons emerging from those different contexts about how we better respond to that rather ugly picture that Lesley just painted of the future for us?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Look, it is an ugly picture, but it means we need to think about how we help nature adapt. So my passion in landscape conservation was always about seeing nature, not just as species and ecosystems in particular places, but seeing nature as processes, functions, flows. We're talking pollination, dispersal, water infiltration, nutrient deposition, decomposition, and all these things make nature a constantly changing and adapting dynamic system, and one that people are part of, not separate from. So I worry a little bit that in Australia and in many other developed countries, we've kind of shifted in recent years towards seeing nature a little bit more as something that has in national parks, but also in areas reserved for nature on farms, not something that is stretched and smeared across whole landscapes in shifting and changing ways. So as a result, we're kind of trying to hold it steady. We've been trying to keep everything where it is, rather than support those kind of underpinning functions and processes. Yet many of those processes are actually nature's kind of inbuilt mechanisms for responding to environmental change. So maintaining those processes, it certainly won't be perfect, but it is a critical part of helping nature do the best job it can adapt to climate change. Now, internationally, people often don't have the luxury of nature reserves. Every bit of the landscape is used for people. So the emphasis is often on function and process. And now, don't get me wrong, I am not saying we should do away with nature reserves, but the lessons learned internationally about how nature's processes and functions can really support people in a more sustainable way. And then in turn, how people can support nature to maintain those processes and functions despite a changing climate. Well, those types of lessons are the kinds of things that can help Australia to reinvigorate our support for nature across whole landscapes, not just in dedicated reserves.
Thanks, Veronica. That's really interesting perspective. Madelon, in the last couple of years, we've seen the corporate and philanthropic sectors move quickly to respond to climate change, and we're seeing the emergence of new and interesting partnerships within the environment sector. Can you describe some of the game-changing partnership and finance models you've witnessed that are seeking to find practical solutions that address the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, this is really interesting because I think we've come a long way, but at the moment, I still think we're really just laying out our game pieces at the moment. We continue to operate in a traditional manner of research and conservation interventions through seeking funding through grants and donations so we can deliver these climate change solutions. This funding is finite and it's highly competitive between the different organizations doing this fantastic work on the ground. We need to work together to secure this new pot of money. And if we agree that climate change and the climate-induced disasters are complex or also called wicked problems, we need to really shift towards a highly collaborative, in a highly networked, dynamic, and integrated approach that accepts all types of knowledge, such as First Nations knowledge, scientific evidence, and other perspectives as an evidence base. And we also need to remind ourselves that there's not just one solution. And you alluded to that, Chris. We need to continue to work in a whole lot of different areas so that we can improve the situation towards a better state. I don't think we can ever fix it, but we need to figure out how we can adapt to this changing climate. And there's a shift already happening. There's all these different perspectives coming together. For me, it's really trying to figure out how we can value nature, how we can put a common ground around nature. And you can see that the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD, and the finance sector and corporate sector driving through environmental, social, corporate governance, ESG actions, funding and reporting, so that they are reducing the risk. Because reports determine that the risk cost of loss of biodiversity is huge. Globally, 44 trillion US of economic value is dependent on biodiversity. And the estimated funding required to reduce risk and restore resilience in the landscapes is estimated to be around 600 to 800 US billion a year. And these are global numbers. And we require this up to 800 billion a year and that needs to go directly into nature, and it needs to come from different sources, including corporate and the finance sector, because there's no way that we as the environmental sector are going to find that much money to do this. And there's development of green, blue bonds, carbon offsetting, and this will all help. But we need to get to a game-changing situation. And for me, that is all about this common language and values. And Veronica spoke to this. It's all about how we as conservationists value nature intrinsically already. We can't just get with the idea that people can destroy nature in such a way. But there's not a lot of people, unfortunately, that think like that. So we need to find this common language to shift this valuing of nature. And for me, I think that that needs to have some quantifying measure. And I think that's natural capital. So how do we value our natural habitats? And we as a conservation sector, environmental sector, with our colleagues in the finance sector and corporate sector, really need to take a lead to demonstrate that we can take an evidence-based approach on measuring, quantifying the value of nature through validated environmental measures, such as the level of biodiversity, soil health, water quality, and then account for these natural assets. And from that balance sheet, be able to find nature positive investments that can help to adapt to climate change and interventions on the ground to help to build that resilience back into the landscape. And that's really exciting, because this could change the economic model. Not easy and very high level concept, but there's lots of flurry happening around this area at the moment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Madelon and Lesley and Veronica. Such interesting comments. There's lots to unpack here. So we've heard from Lesley how dire not only the current situation is at 1.2 degrees, but also what those projected impacts look like under 3 degrees warming. But importantly, we can't lose hope that we've also heard that there's exciting new approaches happening, that we need to think differently, and that we need to think about new economic and partnership models to support practical adaptation to climate adaptation. So we've heard that the environmental sector needs to change. We need to develop large scale to match the scale of the issues, practical on-ground solutions that will measurably help nature and people adapt to a changing climate. And we've also heard that we need to explore new partnerships and funding models with other sectors. So that is really fantastic, and I'm so excited that change is coming. But many people often ask Chris and I, what can we practically do on the ground? So we know that scientists have been recommending practical climate adaptation solutions for decades in some instances in the scientific literature, including a seminal paper by yourself, Veronica, with Dr. Suzanne Probar and others. And unfortunately, though, these solutions have not been widely applied by the environmental sector, and there's very few practical examples that we can point to on the ground. So I have a question for you all now. Can you describe an example where you've witnessed a practical on-ground action that has measurably helped nature and people to adapt to a changing climate? And can you describe what those key factors for success were? Let's start with your thoughts on this, please, Lesley.
Well, I think at a high level, what we need to do, and this is going to sound a bit radical, is stop thinking of ourselves as conservationists, because the word conservation is the problem. Given that the world is changing at a rate that is unprecedented, probably in the whole of the Earth's 4.5 billion year history, thinking of ourselves as conservationists is actually now part of the problem. And it actually robs people of the courage for positive intervention. So I think firstly, the first practical thing to do is a change in mindset, where we think not of only stopping the big bad things, which we still have to do, and then just putting a fence around the rest, but saying what are the positive interventions that we can make in nature that we need to do to take into account the changing external context. One of those, obviously, and I've seen my colleague Nola Hancock log on to this meeting. Hi, Nola. Based on her PhD work, we've done some work about how to be climate ready in revegetation. And that to me is one of the most practical things to do. So it's about thinking about species and provenances of species going back into the landscape to restore, repair, renovate degraded areas, but not in the same way with the same things that were necessarily there before. We actually have to look at, what that site will be like in the future, using the very good climate modelling tools that are now available, and saying what do we want there in the future that will be sustainable, that will provide habitat, that will provide those ecosystem services that Veronica just spoke about, and not be hidebound by the past, because the past is gone. We have to reluctantly wave it goodbye in many areas and say, what is it that we want for a positive future? What do we have to do? And that will take courage, and most of all, a different conservation, anti-conservation in some ways, mindset for the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lesley. So we've heard that restoration practitioners need to be brave, think courageously, and be very future focused. And you've given a fantastic practical example of climate adjusted approaches in revegetation, including that great work that Nola's done with climate adjusted seed. So Veronica, over to you now. What examples have you seen where people have taken action to measurably improve outcomes for people and nature?
So I'll give a 2 thumbs up to Lesley's response for one thing. So that's one of the reasons why Suzanne Prober and other colleagues of mine, we've used the term renovating nature rather than restoring, because we're trying to really evoke exactly what Lesley was just talking about. But given my step into sustainable agriculture, I'm going to give you an example from the production parts of the landscape. And what I'd like to highlight is actually something we've been doing for well over a decade, and it's trying to reestablish native perennial pastures as production pastures. So perennial grasses provide a lot of those really critical services. They retain soil, they improve water infiltration. In other words, they kind of dampen the effects of extreme events, both droughts and floods. Now, to use those as nature-based solutions, the devil's in the detail, because you're searching for that co-benefits space for both production in the long term and for nature. And one of the things we've seen is that, unfortunately, some non-native perennial grasses can readily be used to maximize some of the production benefits. But to get the nature benefits, you really need to concentrate on natives and how you can get diversity into the paddock as well. So it's a situation where there isn't an optimized maximal win-win, but there's a need for trade-offs, but those trade-offs really are possible, really building native perennial pastures that can support a more resilient production system and provide support to those parts of nature that are in the reserves in the landscape. So to talk about key factors for success, I think you need to acknowledge actually the kind of key barrier that's been in place that prevents this from really scaling, as we say in international development. And the barrier has been a lack of support for those kind of compromised trade-off outcomes in formal programs. Most programs will be trying to optimize some sort of production goal or optimize some sort of goal for the environment. And rarely is there formal support for those kind of trade-offs. So what that means is that success in terms of doing a better job establishing native perennial pastures or reestablishing has come from consumer demand. Consumers who are willing and able or make the sacrifices and trade-offs in their own lives to pay a bit more for meat that's been produced on native perennial pastures. That consumer demand then makes it financially viable for producers to actually convert to native perennial pastures over the long term. Now, so far, those sorts of markets have been niche and small, but there's all kinds of opportunities to grow them much larger. And what I like about this example is that it illustrates to me the power of average people, average consumers, to drive landscape scale change in Australia.
Fantastic. Thanks, Veronica. So it's really important for environmental practitioners and everybody to consider the importance of those trade-offs and try and maximize them, but think about them. And a very fantastic example of establishing native perennial grasses and the benefits of doing that. It's fantastic. So Madelon, over to you now. What successful climate adaptation projects have you witnessed in your role?
Well, again, we're still laying out these game pieces. So it's about, using those examples that are happening at smaller scale and try to either scale them up or try to create new opportunities. So I completely agree. We need to move from referring ourselves to conservation as to the sector that builds resilience within our landscapes and, focusing on these important outcomes to maintain the balance and these co-benefits that our ecosystems, provide for us as one of these species on this planet. But this is going to be challenging because, again, this funding that we're getting access to is only finite and it's competitive, and it's going to be harder and harder under the impact of climate change and increasing fires and floods and the need to adapt or help species adapt faster and faster. So an example of something that has just been kickstarted and that the Minderoo Foundation is supporting in Kind for Nature and the Bernard Mary regional group in is that we'll develop, we quantify the world's first regional natural capital balance sheet. It will be around 5.5 million hectares across different habitats, agricultural land, grazing and crops, also some conservation land, some World Heritage sites, and also different land uses. And we're using this balance sheet so we can really identify those trade-offs in a balance sheet that can be understood by different sectors and really looks at, we're monitoring those environmental indicators from the ground up. And we will then work with, in coalition with the pollination group to bring this natural capital account to the market through monetizing it and the development of products for the finance and corporate sector. Now, I'm not an economist or an investor, so for me, that is really hard to grasp. I'm doing this because I can see this as one of the solutions to fix one of our problems in helping build this resilience back, adapting to climate change while we go. But I can see this project as one of the proof of concepts that we can do this at large scale, that we can actually value nature in a language that can be commonly understood by bankers, investors, corporates, and conservationists, and from which we can prioritize interventions on the ground and raise funding for those interventions on the ground. That's just mind-blowing for me, and I'm looking really much forward. So we're hoping to develop this balance sheet by in 15 months' time. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing that, and we're monitoring on the ground eDNA, water quality, species, fuel load, and we'll bring it all together in one balance sheet with accounting for nature's structure, and that's just really exciting. So for me, blue sky thinking, if we can create confidence for investors to start investing into nature positive, funding, and because we don't have other choice, I hope that natural capital will generate this new pot of funding that we desperately need to build that resilience back into our landscapes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Madelon. And I'm sure all the attendees will agree that sounds very exciting. We're really looking forward to hearing how that balance sheet project goes over the next couple of months to years. It's very ambitious and big scale and really interesting in its approach. So we've sort of touched on this a little bit already, but we know that one of the barriers to the uptake and delivery of practical climate adaptation approaches in this, from the scientific literature across to actually doing it on the ground, is that often practitioners have to act in the absence of having long-term evidence, and that they feel deeply concerned about doing the wrong thing. So on this note, how do we think we can give practitioners the best chance of success in helping nature adapt, given this uncertainty? Lesley, you've already sort of touched on this. Could you unpack that a little bit further and describe what your thoughts are on this, please?
Sure. Well, look, most people work in a local area. There's very few practitioners that have projects that are continent in scale. So if you think about your local area and something you want to improve or do or restore or repair or renovate, whichever I word you're using, then there are great tools, produced by the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO, for example, about what the climate is likely to be like in that area on different timeframes. And there's a great website called Climate Change in Australia that you can go to, and you can also use our revegetation, climate ready re-veg guide to access those tools that I spoke about before. So we're not without some degree of support in terms of what your place might be like in the future. All of those tools are developed under a range of scenarios with a range of assumptions, and we do have to take into account that even the weather tomorrow is uncertain, let alone the climate in 20 to 30 years' time. But we've got reasonable tools that we can have some pretty good ideas, especially about temperature. I mean, rainfall is a bit more difficult to project with more confidence, but still the projections are there. So then it's about thinking, well, what might this place, my backyard, be like in 20, 30, 50 years' time? Will the stuff that was growing there before be able to survive that. And you can use other great tools like the Atlas of Australia to understand what the climatic niches are of lots of species. And then just having a go. And, you know, some of those decisions won't be perfect, you know, in the face of uncertainty, and it comes back to having a bit of courage to you know, make some educated guesses. But the thing is, what we've got to weigh up against is the default option of not doing it. And the default option is that globally, we will probably lose 1 million or so species. That's the latest estimate, you know, within the next half century or so. So the do nothing option is the worst option. The having a go, taking a bit of a risk, but an educated risk based on the best possible science is really, in my mind, the only way that we can go forward. I think, you know, everybody's frightened by cane toads. You know, whenever I talk about the need to move species or to grow different things, they'll go, oh my God, but what about invasive species like the cane toad? And the cane toad was a truly horrendous mistake because it was based on no available science at all. We can do a lot better than that now. And I think we, you know, have to actually have a bit of courage, be willing to take some risks with the best available tools that we have at this time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lesley. So we've heard you described some fantastic new tools that that practitioners can use, and that do nothing is not an option for us any longer, that we need to be brave and courageous and take a risk-based approach to the work that we're doing so that we can help maximise the success in a changing climate. I'm going to come over to you now, Veronica. What's your thoughts on this? How do we give practitioners the best chance of success?
So I'll build on Lesley's response, which was essentially a bit of a have a go. And what I'll articulate is we need to have a go, but in multiple ways at once. So let me step back and explain why for a second. So to me, it's been really important to remember here that our main source of uncertainty is not really related to the fact that we don't have a large body of historical evidence about what works and what doesn't. It's related to the fact that climate change is giving us a shifting baseline, an accelerated shifting baseline in the conditions under which we're going to kind of live our lives and do things. So even if we had a huge body of historical evidence, the sorts of things that worked 20 years ago are unlikely to work today and almost certainly won't work 20 years from now. So to me, what that's always meant is that we need to change how we make decisions, how we use evidence, how we view and manage risk. And we're really lucky, actually, that there's a large body of research on decision-making under uncertainty. And there are, in fact, many established approaches. Our challenge right now is that they just look different from what has become a really, actually culturally entrenched way of making decisions. Culturally, we've become kind of addicted to this optimizing a particular outcome, maximizing our efficiency. But those types of decision-making approaches have been shown to be the least suited to situations of uncertainty. So let me give you an example of a decision-making approach that does work really well for uncertainty, and it's a portfolio approach. So when you think about it, this is already used in the way, you know, people manage like, you know, stock portfolios and whatnot, right? And it's the idea that you have many options going at once. Now, farmers in developing countries often do this already. It's much more culturally established. They do it almost reflexively. They farm many diverse products in case one or more of them fail. And increasingly, we're looking to incorporate products much more from local ecosystems. So using indigenous agriculture to much more directly use and farm nature as part of a mixed and diverse farming system. Now, if we take some of those thoughts and apply them here at home, well, when doing restoration or renovation or whatever we want to call it, it is about using those seeds from many different provenances at once, which is part of climate ready restoration and has already been brought up today. When reestablishing native perennial pastures, it might be about putting different species mixes in different places. But then really critically, monitoring and adapting much more rapidly as you see which of them actually germinate and establish under different climate conditions that are emerging for us. So the real lesson is to empower everyone to be active experimenters.
Fantastic. Thanks, Veronica. So I think practitioners are great at having a go, as you said, and learning on the job. So I think many practitioners are very well suited to that style, and you've given us some fantastic examples of ways we can think when we're dealing with uncertainty in a changing climate, some structure around that, which is fantastic. Madelon, over to you. In order to meet the scale of the impacts that we're going to witness in a changing climate, we know that the environmental sector is going to really urgently need to take up new and emerging technologies and apply them in the work that we do. So Madelon, can you tell us about some of those game-changing new technologies that you've heard about that show great promise to help both people and nature adapt with the changing climate ahead?
There are so many great developments around, and rapid seeding using drones and resilient seeds, investigating better resilient species to live in changed environments or changed habitats is really critical. But I think Veronica hits it on the head. We need to start working outside our paradigm. We need to start managing these projects, these wicked problems in a much more agile way, but also need to integrate capturing this local knowledge and perspectives and action and what's happening on the ground. And for me, that really relies on efficacy of monitoring of nature and ecosystem health, and that we're more effectively share all this knowledge that we're at the moment not doing very well. And I think then only we can shift from monitoring extinctions to tackling them through effective action on the ground and monitor the impact that we have in building resilience and restoring, making habitats climate ready, making landscapes climate ready for the future. And for me, I think one of the most important technology is, databases and frameworks. We can really look at how to figure out to build, and that's what we're trying to do, to build a data platform. And Lesley mentioned the Living Atlas of Australia. There are a lot of great databases around already, but they're not really talking to each other. Some are open source, some are limited open source, but they're all put in their knowledge, and some of them aren't. Most of them aren't updated very regularly. If you actually look at the currency of the data within those data frameworks, some of them 2014, and we're making decisions based upon that data on what we're doing, government funding and all that sort of things. And that's just not good enough. So we need to increase our efficacy of monitoring of nature. And that's a lot of, drone, earth observation and other interesting stuff that just blows my mind as a conservationist. But we also need to figure out how we can build this data platform, working with our partners. And there's lots of questions around the governance, who will own this data platform. How can we make sure that people are going to share their validated environmental indicators within that data platform, and still allowing them to campaign, seek funding, fundraise, do whatever they need with their expertise, be able to explain and demonstrate their expertise in the work that they're doing. And I think those are big questions, and that's exactly why I love my job, trying to figure out the frameworks on doing that and bringing all these different partners together that all have a stake in this to do this. One of the technologies, an example of the data platform is a digital twin. I never heard of a digital twin, and I'm sure a lot of people that we speak to today haven't heard of it either, but Google it. It's the digital twin of New South Wales or Victoria, and they tell you on the phone now what time your bus arrives. Imagine if you could build a digital twin for the whole of Australia and globally for nature. telling us where we need to prioritize actions, where threatened species are threatened by a high fuel load, and populations can be wiped out in a moment through a flood. Imagine if we could get to that. That's what I would like to think of that we can.
Wow, I like the ambition, Madelon. Thank you very much. So we're almost at question time, but before we dive in, something I know I've struggled with over my career is maintaining the rage, continuing to fight the good fight, because certainly there are days where it just feels like it's unwinnable. Let's start with you, Veronica. How do you maintain the rage and stay resilient in the face of what feels like an impossible challenge?
Well, Chris, I have to say this is one that for some reason I don't find that hard. And I think it's because I've been surrounded in my research career by people who research resilience. And the research into resilience tells us that what resilience actually is it's about having the capacity, the skills, the tools, the mindset for learning, for change, even for transformation. And I feel like I see that capacity growing around me all the time. The nature of the conversations that we're having, like the one today, is growing and changing. You've got organizations like Farmers for Climate Action that are proving that producers are absolutely confident about being part of the solution. You've got the rise of impact investing, and much of what we've been hearing from Madelon today. You've got the people who have the financial capital to drive change, who are increasingly interested in doing that in ways that achieve environmental, social, and governance goals. And so much of that rise in impact investing has been driven by shareholder demand. It's been driven by demand from the masses. And that reminds me that addressing climate change in nature positive ways is a social movement. Social movements take time. Success is often not very apparent when we're in the middle. But I think we are in the middle. We're in the messy middle. But that means that we are in the process of transforming our future. And we just need to keep open to learning and changing ourselves, because success may end up looking very different in the end from what we might expect or assume right now.
Thanks so much, Veronica. Madelon, what gives you hope and what would you like to share?
I completely agree with Veronica. We're right in the middle of this transition, as I like to call it. However, people, the public, and sectors won't actually change their behavior, including ourselves as the conservation sector. I don't know what word to use anymore, Lesley, now. Including ourselves as the conservation sector. We won't change until we are directly impacted. And it's great to be speaking to, with champions and speaking to all of you to try to figure out how we can really start getting into this driver's seat. Because if the impacts of climate change and these climate-induced disasters are increasing and becoming worse, we need to start leading. And the business sector, finance sector are waking up. And I think this is the ideal opportunity for us to go and sit on the driver's seat, take leadership, and start talking to the other sectors in our language in a way that they understand, to start valuing nature, even if that's in a different way that we value nature, no longer this intrinsic way. But we've got the opportunity to place this high on the top of the agenda of governments, finance, and corporate sectors. And we can demonstrate through our evidence-based approach, how we've always done our work, that we can actually get from a concept to a demonstration and find this common language and value. And that's really exciting, because it's a new paradigm. It's moving from a traditional approach to, and from a crisis management approach to a very proactive way of, I dare to say, and I might upset a lot of people, new way of doing science.
Thanks, Madelon. I love it. And finally, Lesley, what would you like to share in terms of hope?
Because I work on climate change, people ask me all the time if I've got hope for the future. And my usual response is that I've come to the conclusion that hope has to be a strategy as much as it is an emotion, because if we don't have hope, we give up. And if we give up, we are really screwed. So there's no alternative but to have hope and optimism for the future, because the alternative to that is all those bad things. I mean, but the other thing is that, a lot of people say that the antidote to despair is action. So just doing something, as Veronica said before, have a go. That's a lot better than doing nothing. And my mantra is a little saying by Desmond Tutu, and I've got it written on a Post-it note above my desktop computer in my office, which I haven't been to for 4 months, but I do remember the Post-it. And Desmond Tutu said, do your little bit of good for the world where you are, because it's all those little bits of good added together that overwhelm the world. So when I feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the climate issue, I just come back to myself and think, what can I do? What am I good at? Who can I influence? I'm just going to focus on that. And none of us can do everything, but everybody can do something. So that's how I go forward.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lesley, and to all the panelists. It's very inspiring to hear your stories of how you maintain hope in the face of this uncertainty and the challenges ahead. But I think that many people will share that it's really important that we all start with our own resilience, and we've heard how we need to influence the others as much as we can and really roll up our sleeves and get started. It's very exciting. So thank you so much for your conversation today. There's so much we could continue to talk about, but unfortunately we need to wrap up the formal discussion here and move on to some questions from the guests. So we've had a few questions posted already in the chat, so I'll start by asking you those questions. But for all the attendees online, if you have any further questions, please post them. We'd love to hear your questions and thoughts, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we can. So please remember again to select the chat with all panelists and attendees option when you're posting, so we can see all your messages. So my first question is, I think for you, Veronica, although everyone might have a view on this. It's a question from Hugh. Do you have any views on how to bring the community on the journey of renovating nature with new species and new approaches?
So that's an interesting question. Look, I think, hey, audience, you guys are community. So events like this are one part of it, right? So a lot of it is just about continuing to communicate and communicating in a positive way. I do like to kind of take hope in a sense from reflecting on evolution. I mean, once upon a time, we were all primordial soup. I think today is an improvement on that. So change in the ecosystems and the species around us isn't inherently a bad thing. Now we have to make sure that change actually does occur in positive ways. I've also spent a little bit of time working with a catchment management authority in Victoria, where we started to explore this and thought, well, actually, some of those simple kind of nature interpretation sort of signs could really be changed to start to communicate the kind of positive messages. So at an ephemeral wetland, or a wetland that might become increasingly ephemeral, rather than having kind of signposts about the species that live there, you could have signposts about how magical ephemerality is, so that you start to kind of communicate the sense of value in place that's independent of the specific species that reside there at the time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Veronica. I really enjoyed that common theme today of hearing about the importance of process and dynamic sort of movement in ecosystems. It's fantastic. I have another question. I think this one's for you, Lesley, this time, please. If looking forward, starting to think about novel ecosystems and thinking less about conserving the past, how do we make decisions about what's important and what our priorities are?
Well, that's where science and values and ethics and philosophy all collide? And there's no right answer to that question, because what I might value in a place might be different to what even the other panelists might value in the place. But I think there's some fundamentals. I mean, I think we all value diversity. You know, we all want to keep the species that are now on the planet and not lose them at an accelerated rate. So keeping as diverse ecosystems that do diverse things and provide diverse processes and services is a goal, you know, and I think that's probably something that we can all agree on. You know, I think we can also, you know, we can value different things about different species. Some species will be more functionally more important in landscapes than in others, and we might know something about that or not. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, minimizing the loss and managing the transformation to minimize the loss, be it in species or processes, is what we've got to keep in mind. But as I said earlier, that may require some far more interventionist activity than perhaps conservationists have been comfortable with in the past. It will certainly mean we've got to move a hell of a lot more species because they'll go extinct where they are now. And it also will mean that we should be brave enough to create new habitats for things, you know, especially in degraded lands. Well, let's put some wetlands in, you know, let's build stuff, and a lot of things will come. So, you know, to go back to the question, there's no right answer to that question because we all have different values. But if we can unite to keep the stuff that has evolved thus far, and to build processes and habitats that can maintain those things as long as possible, I think that's a good aim.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lesley. And Veronica, I can see you're nodding your head furiously. Would you like to add to that, Lesley's comment?
One brief thing, which is simply to say that that increasingly adaptation science, like the science of how you do this crazy change thing, is becoming ever more a kind of codified discipline. And one of the things that's been part of that is research into how do you flush out those held values? How do you identify which values are universal? How do you create social processes that allow people to come together and wrestle with those different values to come to some sort of, you know, action conclusion? As Lesley says, there is no one right one, but there could be processes to guide it. So, you know, I'm really excited about that kind of new science that's starting to emerge that will help us in this journey.
Fantastic. And Madelon, a question to you now from the attendee, Dee. We can, talking about measuring the health of natural processes in the landscape, how do we include them in the balance sheet, do you think?
Yeah, so what we need to start measuring is condition. So we need to not just take one measurement, you know, either at small scale or large scale, but we need to continuously measure. So that's why this efficacy of monitoring is so critical, either continuously or frequently. So in some cases it won't be as, but you know, if we could start measuring some environmental indicators through satellite or drones, if we could really harness citizen scientists and land managers to, you know, to bring data in some way, we could, I'm pretty sure we can monitor the whole of Australia quite easily. And we have an opportunity, of course, to also use artificial intelligence and modeling that, you know, isn't based on historic data, but is based on this new data that we're collecting and all these climate change models that are in existence, and trying to figure out some really clever models. And I'm not a data nerd, but sorry to all the data nerds there, you're fantastic. We need you, because we need to figure out how we can start sort of forecasting, predicting where we need to focus our, you know, precious funding, and where we need to, where our resilience building has most and delivery of value. And I completely agree with Lesley. You know, the value of nature is hard to determine because everybody else will attach a different value to its surroundings, social processes, all these aspects. But if we can put some index on, you know, ecosystems measures, we can start getting to some sort of agreed index that we can make decisions on. And we still need to protect, you know, red-tailed black cockatoos or certain tree species and restore these habitats. But I think we need to figure out how we can agree on this common language. And for me, that balance sheet, that natural capital balance sheet, is really critical in all of that.
Fantastic, thanks, Madelon. One of the things I've really enjoyed today is hearing all these new and exciting terms that I think some of my comrades in the environmental sector may not have really been exposed to, including myself, such as digital twins, artificial intelligence, talking about ecological renovation, which I am very familiar with. But there's lots of new exciting terms, including maybe rebranding our sector entirely. So I think there's a lot of change ahead for our sector. Okay, I have another question here from panelist Bob, which I think is for you, Veronica, please. So individual landowners, people working at that sort of paddock farm level, are really important in delivering the outcomes that we need in a changing climate. And they also need to sort of improve or manage their sustainable farms to improve productivity for themselves. So how do we go about successfully delivering these integrated outcomes where of sort of working with farmers to improve outcomes for productivity on their farms, but also improving outcomes for nature?
Right. So I think it's a kind of combination of intervening at multiple levels, right? So any really important changes actually require change in a system. They require multiple actors to come together and make change. And so you know, lots of farmers. I mean, when I was doing, you know, field research, all of my data was collected on farms, you know, with the generosity of farmers who were willing to let me come onto their properties. And I don't think I met a single one who wasn't actually interested in long-term sustainability, stewardship of you know, of the environment on their properties. So there's lots of interest, but it's about supporting them with the right information, particularly the right information around multiple options that they can choose. People like to have options and then they can select what works best for them rather than someone telling them exactly what they should do. And we haven't been wildly good at that. And then the other thing I would say is that no individual can change a system. You know, they need access to, you know, to the inputs required for a change, you know, whether it's native seed or, you know, whatever. They need support to manage the risk of doing something different until it gets really reestablished. And traditionally, governments haven't necessarily seen themselves in that type of risk, you know, risk management kind of position, but there's an opportunity to, or insurance companies, you know, insuring people who are taking the risks to make a positive change rather than insuring people to kind of pay out when their current production systems fail, which they inherently will in many cases. So it's really about kind of getting the private sector involved, getting the government involved, providing options to landowners, and there's lots of motivation out there to actually, you know, make those new and different choices.
Well, thank you very much, Veronica, for that great answer. I'm really sorry, everybody. That's all we're going to have time for today, so we'll have to wrap things up. A tremendous thank you to Lesley, Madelon and Veronica for joining us today, and to my co-host Elisa, as well as all the team at GA and WWF for bringing this together. Please remember, we're very committed to be working with all of you to really give nature a fighting chance in what is going to be a pivotal decade. So if you would like more information, please visit our website, use the hashtag Climate Ready Restoration, and get out there and share what you're doing on platforms like Restore. We've put these links in the chat. So thank you all for your time, and have a great day.